Okay. This is the third lecture of medical psychology for fall 2020. Today's lecture is going to be about intelligence, like IQ, and about learning as it relates to medical psychology. I will put the video up. I will also put the first two quizzes up this weekend. And then you'll have 2 weeks from the time I put them up to finish them. You can look at the slides while you do them, so it shouldn't be too difficult. And I'm rather flexible if there's an issue. I mean, I took time putting them up, so not that flexible though. All right, so today is going to be about intelligence and learning. So intelligence, I'll talk about it first. First of all, I'll go over various definitions of intelligence based on different historical psychologists, neuroscientists, things like this. Then I'll talk about different theories of intelligence, also postulated by different sort of psychologists over the last century or two. And I'll introduce some of the historical and modern intelligence tests, the way that people actually test intelligence. I'll talk about the consequences of intelligence. So what does intelligence actually do in the real world? How does it affect your health? And then I will finally talk about heritability of intelligence, sort of where does intelligence come from? And heritability here means, of course, how much of an effect does your genes, DNA, have on intelligence. Then after I finish that, there will be only a few slides about learning. I will introduce classical conditioning and instrumental conditioning because those are going to be a common theme throughout the semester. And then I will talk about specifically how, for example, instrumental conditioning could cause avoidance behavior in a phobia. Okay, so first of all, we'll start off with intelligence. What is intelligence? You might have some laypersons, so non-experts. If you ask someone on the street what is intelligence, they might say, oh, you can solve problems practically. You have verbal ability, so you sound smart, right? Social competence, so are you able to manipulate people or make people like you? These are things that Sternberg found in a study of lay people asking what they thought intelligence was. You can think a little bit about what you think intelligence is too. Is there something missing here? We can also look at what experts, so-called experts, define intelligence as. So for example, Thorndike, a famous psychologist, animal psychologist from the early 1900s, said in one of his books, the power of good responses from the viewpoint of truth or facts. So if you're an organism, are you able to perform the behavior that gets you a good result, right? The capability to receive education, so basically the ability to learn, Asendorf, or the ability to carry out abstract thinking. This is interesting. He mentioned abstractions, Terman. Of course, these things could all be different aspects of intelligence, and we'll find today that it's not so easy to define intelligence at all. Looking at theories of intelligence, well, of course, the theory is related to the test that you use to measure intelligence. One of the first ones that is well known is Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon developed the first intelligence test called the Binet-Simon test in early 1900s, 1905, 1911. And then the reason they developed it was that actually the French Ministry of Public Instruction asked them to develop it in 1904 for the purpose of identifying children that need special education, right? And so basically the purpose was to identify children that needed extra or a different type of education than the normal education. So Binet and Simon developed this test, and the test included the following types of tasks in the test. First was sort of the simplest, following a lighted match, a light with the eyes. So this very basic physiological, behavior. Naming the parts of the body, hand, head, shoulders. Third was counting coins. Naming pictures, so is this a picture of a dog? What is this a picture of? Oh, it's a house, etc. Next was recalling digits, so remembering digits that the experimenter gave to the person. If I said to you, remember 572963, and then I ask you again in 10 seconds, 572963, right? And I see how accurate you are. Next was word definitions. So what does it mean to ruminate, or what does it mean to play, or what does it mean to, what does aspect mean, or something like, those are abstract, that's difficult, but you get the idea. And then finally, find rhymes for difficult words. Orange, maybe. I assume it was in French, so... Anyway, so the idea was that difficulty was increasing. The difficulty of the problems they gave within these subjects, and as you increase the subjects, was increasing. And as a result, you would find a point where the performance of the testee, the subject, dropped off. And that would determine the subject's mental age. So a child with a mental age of 7 can do the tasks designed for children with the age of 7, so that the average or normal 7-year-old can do those tasks. Then that's the cutoff. They say, oh, you have a mental age of 7 if you can do exactly those tasks, up to those tasks, and then none past it. But not for age 8. So originally they only tested for mental age 3 to 10. And then later they updated it to go up through 12 and then to 15, and also for adults. Of course, this mental age was not directly useful, because as you can see, you have a mental age and you have a chronological age. It's sort of two numbers. I guess you could subtract them or something. But William Stern had this idea to compare the mental age with the actual age, the chronological, biological age of the person, the subject, and make a ratio. So for example, for this top one, the mental age is 7, the chronological age is 6. So 7 divided by 6 is 1.17, and then you multiply that by 100 to make an IQ number, so 117. If you're a mental age of 5 and you're actually 6 years old, then you have lower than normal intelligence, so it's 83, etc. This is not modern IQ. This is still an IQ made by William Stern. And the purpose was to just get a single number that represented how advanced or retarded the mental development was of the subject over the chronological development. Next, simultaneously, Charles Spearman had the idea in the early 1904 to test children in his surroundings with cognitive tasks. So he also used basic things like memory, light. Can you detect changes in light? Can you measure weight? Can you respond to sounds? And he observed correlations between different tests. So he did a bunch of different tests, and then he used a correlation. He used something called factor analysis, which we'll talk about more in personality in the next lecture. And based on factor analysis, he postulated there was two factors that contribute to intelligence, or I guess two levels of factors. One is S factor, which are specific abilities. So are you good at language? Are you good at memory, etc.? And then G was sort of a general intelligence that affected all the other specific abilities. So all cognitive abilities were fueled by the general intelligence, G, but the S, the specific ability, also has the effect depending on what the specific task is. So here's a picture that might make it more clear to you. So here's your general intelligence, which correlates with your ability in different specific subtasks. So for example, reasoning. Are you good at logic, like reasoning? Are you good at spatial ability? Are you good at memory? Are you good at language, vocabulary? Do you have fast processing speed? Can you find things quickly and think quickly? And so G correlated with ability in all of these, but also each of these has its own separate factor in G for each person. And then for different specific tasks, task 1, task 2, task 3, different types of reasoning tasks, the person's ability would correlate with their ability in all of these. So based on, of course, I have the arrows going this way, but actually, of course, what he did was he did the tasks, made some categories, and then measured how much the ability in each of these would correlate with the specific abstract categories that he had made. And the purpose, of course, is you want to predict the performance of the subject in any given task, and you can do that by building a model that factors how the weight or their of each of their specific G and their specific factors. So now we'll move on to the sort of more modern IQ test that's based on Spearman's idea, and of course the other ideas as well. This is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, WAIS, which was first published in 1939 and then revised several times since then. So the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale provides a score by summarizing the results of different subtests. This is the newest version from 2008. So first it gives you the full scale IQ, which is G, general intelligence ability. And then it also gives you the general ability index, which is subsets of tests, so reasoning, memory, spatial, language, etc. And there's sort of four different indices. There's the verbal index, the perceptual reasoning index, the working memory index, and the processing speed index. And with these subscores, this is actually often used in neuropsychology to assess if someone has some brain damage, what part of the brain was damaged. Because actually it turns out that these different types of behaviors or abilities or whatever you want to call them, they are often sort of strongly linked to certain parts of the brain. And when you damage those parts of the brain, it affects one specific ability and less the other abilities. So it's used in neuropsychology. To give you an example of verbal comprehension test, you might ask the subject, what is steam made of? What is pepper? So you're asking for information. That's one type of test. Another is similarities. What ways are a lion and a tiger alike? They're both cats. I don't know. In what ways are an hour and a week alike? They're both, measures of time, etc. I'm just going to go through these four different ones. So perceptual reasoning is basically you have like some blocks and you have to build this from these blocks. Of course, you rotate this guy around and you put it here, and then you put this guy over here, and then this guy here and this guy here. So that's what you solve you, and they time you, and they see how fast you do it and sort of how you think through it, I guess. Next is the working memory index, which is testing working memory. So again, like the first task, the Bidet and Simon, read a list of digits and you have to write them down. So I'll say 10, 9, 37, 6, 2, 15, 85. You have to remember them. And I'll say go, and you have to write down the digits that you can remember. And then a little bit more difficult, you have to write them down backwards. And finally, processing speed is, for example, find symbol in the picture below, and you have to find the exact symbol. So, boom, boom, boom. You have to, perform some parallel or serial task to test how fast you are at doing some task. Okay, so that is the WAS, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale. And what they do is basically they define IQ based on relative to a control population of the same age. And the number is made so that it's normally distributed and the mean is 100, right? Well, you assume it's normally distributed and the mean is made to be 100. So the IQ points is here. It's the percentage of the group. This is a normal distribution, the bell curve, as you may know. And the standard deviation here is made to be 15, which means that with any of this, there's roughly like 66.7% or something of the total distribution. And this leads to some conclusions. Well, for example, below 70, which is defined as an intellectual disability often, where you have impairments in your daily or social life, there's 2.3% of all people will fall below 70, whereas 97.7% will fall above 70. 15.9% will fall below 85, whereas 84.1 will fall above 85. Similarly, 84.1 will fall below 115, and 15.9% will fall above 115. And then you have sort of the extreme geniuses above 130, where you have 2.3% above 130. Mensa is a group, a club for sort of geniuses, and they only invite you if you have an intelligence test that's above 130. It's a pretty weird group. And so these IQ tests are mostly used for the purpose of diagnosing intellectual disabilities, for the purposes of education and things like this. Intellectual disabilities are deficits in mental abilities diagnosed before the age of 18. So, for example, one might have a deficit in reasoning, problem solving, planning, academic learning, or the ability to learn from experience. And these are defined as follows. A mild disability is between 50 and 70. Moderate disability is between 35 and 55 roughly. Severe disability is between 20 and 35 or 40. And profound disability is below 20 or 25, where the person probably can't do very much at all. It's almost unresponsive to most stimuli, doesn't understand what's happening. Typical causes for different types of disability are, for example, Down syndrome, which is a trisomy having an extra chromosome 21, prevalence about 0.59%. 0.059%. Of course, there's different types of brain damage before, during, or after birth. Another type of birth-related defect in the brain, or more cranial anomalies, microcephaly, which is basically having parts of the brain not developed enough, where you're missing parts of the cortex, or I guess even other parts of the brain. These are the major causes, of course, for disabilities. One thing you might notice that's sort of unfair in this type of test is that it uses verbal comprehension, and it has these sort of numbers, remembering numbers and things like that. And you might think, well, that's all well and good, but what if you grew up in a society or a culture where there's you don't use math, and you don't the language is different, it has totally different concepts in it, right? So if you meet a space alien or something like that, like, how do you measure their intelligence? There has to be like a culture-free way of measuring intelligence. And so John Raven developed another way of testing intelligence, or a theory of intelligence, called the Raven progressive matrices, where it's much more related to the abstract ability to recognize relationships between objects. So, for example, like, you're supposed to fill in, which one of these is most appropriate. Probably this one fits the pattern best. This is a very simple example, of course. Okay, so that's sort of the cultural free influence of intelligence. One way to measure it, for example, if you meet people in some isolated culture. I've already talked about some multi-factor analysis theories, but there's Thurstone, who we've already talked about, introduced a multi-factor theory, and he basically said, this is sort of like armchair theory. There's 7 primary mental abilities. He separates 7 categories: associative memory, which is rote memory; number ability, mathematics; perceptual speed, which is perceive details or searching for something in a picture or a scene; reasoning is sort of logic, or figuring out what something must be based on constraints; space is spatial transformations; verbal comprehension, which is language understanding; and word fluency is ability to generate words. These are the 7 abilities he just made up and said these must be the natural divisions of mental abilities. So this is Thurstone's theory. I'm just presenting some different sort of theories that came about over time for how people were categorizing intelligence, thinking it worked. Uh, Raymond Cattell suggested a couple of different factors. He said there was basically two types of intelligence. One is what he called crystallized intelligence, which is kind of like wisdom, sort of knowledge and skills, experience. It's culturally dependent, right? Because of course it's based on lots of experience. It's partly measured with Weiss because of, for example, things like asking for numbers or for asking for language type things. And it increases with age. Usually it accumulates as you age. The other type of intelligence is sort of fluid intelligence, which is more like processing power, reasoning or acquisition of new information, the ability to see patterns in relationships, abstract things. This is more cultural independence. It's more measured by, for example, Raven matrices. And it will increase in childhood but stabilize in young adulthood when you're a teenager or early young adult. As I mentioned, these are all sort of armchair theories, though. I've gone over a couple of different ways of measuring intelligence and ways that people have sort of separated or categorized intelligence. But, of course, we want to know in medical psychology, what does intelligence do? How can we use these different theories to actually inform health? And, of course, this isn't a neuroscience course, but does different IQ mean we have a different brain? How can we look at the brain and say, oh, this is a better brain for this type of IQ or something? Can we do that? Well, there's a little bit of evidence that some structures or properties of the brain can be correlated with intelligence. For example, here's a study from Cole and colleagues, 2012. He looked at the connectivity of an area in the left prefrontal cortex, LPFC, and this area's connectivity with other parts of the brain correlated with fluid IQ. So in other words, if this area of the brain is connected to lots of areas of the brain, measured via something called a resting state MRI, then the person tended to have more fluid intelligence, as measured by, for example, Raven progressive matrices. Resting state MRI is basically where you have the person sort of lay in the MRI, the brain scanner, and you don't have them do anything, and you just measure the correlations basically between different areas that are active, and that lets you make sort of draw functional connections between the different areas. If this one's active, this one also tends to be active, which means there must be some connections between them. It's called functional connectivity. We won't go over much of that in this course. So maybe there is some aspect of the brain that can predict, either cause or is caused by having better fluid intelligence. What does IQ do? What does intelligence actually do? Well, one, it predicts academic success in life and job success. So there's an R, remember correlation, R, we talked about that last course, correlates with basically getting a high school degree. Did you graduate from high school? R of 0.69. It correlates with academic achievement in the U.S., so how good your grades are. Do you graduate from college? Between R of between 0.4 and 0.63. And it correlates with job performance, like are you rated highly at your job? Do you have a good job? Do you have high pay? Stuff like this. Between 0.5 and 0.6. Hunter and Hunter, in a very famous meta-analysis, showed a correlation of job performance and IQ of 0.54. Whereas other things, for example, that you'd think would predict job performance would be your CV, your resume, redactual, right? How much does that correlate with job performance? Well, actually, having a really good CV doesn't correlate as much with job performance as IQ, or performance during the job interview. You'd think if they performed during a job interview, they would do better on the job. Actually, no, it only correlates R of 0.14. So actually, if you want good job performance, your best thing to measure, it seems, based on this data, is someone's IQ. There might be some other better things to measure. For example, how conscientious they are, which is what we're going to talk about next class, personality. But IQ does seem to have a positive correlation with job performance and other markers of education and success. Another thing is health. Well, does IQ correlate with health? There was a study from 90,000 Scottish-born people in 1921 where they got an IQ test in 1932 when they were 11 years old. Then it was repeated again in people born in 1936 were tested when they were 11 in 1947. And then they basically asked the people much later in their life. It was investigated how many of them had died, basically, right? How long they lived. And if you look at the mean IQ of people who died by the time they looked at the data, then the IQ of those who had passed away was 97.7, and the IQ of people who were still alive was 104.6. So, in other words, if you had a higher IQ, you're more likely to be alive than dead. Or, I guess, if you're alive, you're more likely to have a higher IQ. Similarly, cardiovascular disease, very much smaller effect here. IQ of those who did not have a heart disease, cardiovascular disease, was 4 points higher, roughly. Of course, there's different possible reasons for this. We already talked about IQ affects your education. And of course, if you have a better education, you'll get a better job, which will give you more money, which will let you live sort of a more healthy life, maybe. Another possible cause may be disease management. You might, because of higher intelligence, know when to go to a doctor or be more responsible, right? Or you might have less possibility of psychiatric illness, which would maybe be a cause of some of these getting unhealthy. For example, if some people with certain psychiatric illnesses cause bad people to not take care of themselves, or to be unsanitary or something, and then that would cause higher mortality or maybe higher chance of cardiovascular disease. So there's lots of possible reasons for this. We don't know what causes it, but there is the correlation between IQ and health based on this study. Finally, for IQ, we're going to talk about the heritability of IQ. Where does IQ come from? We already talked about maybe the brain being related to IQ, fluid intelligence, but a lot of course, brain connectivity is determined by some by genes and some by your environment. We can look at the part accounted for by genes. Heritability is often expressed as what's called the H squared, or H2, which is the percentage of variation in IQ scores explained by genetic differences. So H2, if it's 100%, it means variation is completely explained by genetic differences. In other words, if you tell me how much the genes are different, I can tell you what the IQ is, I think. H2 is 0% means that there's no value in explaining variation. So no matter what you tell me the genetic difference is, I can't predict how different the IQs will be. So this is usually done with twin studies, because the reason twins are used is because they're often raised in the same environment, reared together, right? They're raised in the same house, they're the same age, they usually look similar, so they're treated very similarly in school, and so the environmental effect is minimized. So we assume that the shared environment is about 100%. Meanwhile, different types of twins, monozygotic or dizygotic twins, which is identical versus fraternal twins, have on average different amounts of genetic material shared. So monozygotic twins who are from the same egg have 100% of their genes are shared, whereas normal twins, which are basically siblings, have about on average 50% of their genes are shared. And so we use this 50% difference between them to try to suss out how much of the variation in IQ is explained by this variance in genes. Just to show you what I mean by twins having different amounts of shared genetic material. Well, dizygotic twins, this type, is basically fraternal twins. You could have a girl and a boy. They can look very different. There's basically two sperm fertilize two eggs, and they both happen to implant in the womb and grow. So they're basically just normal siblings that are born at the same time. Normal brother, normal sister. So they share on average 50%. And here's results from this study showing the amount of genetic material shared. You can see the average is 0.5, 50%, and there's a standard deviation of about 0.036, quite small. Monozygotic twins, on the other hand, are from the same egg, which splits, and they share 100% of genetic material. So how do you get this h2, this h squared? Well, we want to look at the concordance of IQ and twins. So for example, if we have twin A, monozygotic or dizygotic, and twin B, and we want to see basically what the concordance between these twins are. If twin A has 100 and twin B has 100, or twin A has 20 and twin B has 20, that means there's probably going to be a high correlation. This is compared to the situation like this, where twin A has 120, but twin B has only 30 IQ or something. Then it's very different, right? You can't predict from twin A what twin B's will be. Whereas in this case, you can predict. If twin A has 100, you can predict that twin B is going to have 100, right? So we don't know which one of these is the real situation in the real world. And what they do is they measure, right? You go and you find a bunch of monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins, and you measure the concordance in IQ. So here is the concordance of IQ between monozygotic twins reared together, 86%, and dizygotic twins reared together, 55%. And here's a little bit different, is identical twins reared apart, so different environments, have 76%. The problem here is we don't know how much, how do you measure reared apart? How different is my house versus your house when you were growing up? How different is your house versus your best friend's house, right? It's hard to quantify that. Whereas the genes concordance, we know that 50% and 100%, we know roughly the exact difference between the genes. So that's why we use the reared together, and we don't pay attention to the environment. We don't know what factors to use in a measurement of similarity of environment. The amount of colors in in your room, the amount that your mother talks to you every day. There's too many possibilities. So usually we'll use reared together, monozygotic versus dizygotic, to suss out the contribution of genes that's independent of environment. There might be an interaction between genes and environment, of course, that we can't get at, but that's, we don't have a better way of doing this. So anyways, we're going to look at 86 versus 55. And so the h squared will be, the formula is 2 times the concordance, the r of MT together, minus the r concordance of dizygotic together, which is 2 times 86 minus 55, which is 62%. So the H2, the heritability of the amount of difference in IQ explained by genes is 62%. And this is typical. Usually lots of different studies show between 60 and 80%. Okay, so now I'm going to give a few slides about learning, which is related to IQ. We saw that to some extent IQ is sort of how one hypothesis was that one part of intelligence is how quickly you can learn new things. Of course, in medical psychology, a lot of the things we're going to look at in terms of diseases, neuropsychiatric disorders, things like this turn out to be caused by effectively a type of conditioning, a type of basic learning. And the way that those can be addressed, or therapies for those, often use another type of conditioning, basic learning, to unlearn or learn over those undesirable associations. So maybe you all know Pavlov, very famous guy, got a Nobel Prize for his experiment with a dog. This is called classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, you associate 2 stimuli that are normally not associated. So in this case, there's a bell, which is just some stimulus that the dog normally doesn't care about. And there's another stimulus that causes an unconscious reaction. This is the difference between classical conditioning and instrument conditioning. This stimulus, evokes some physiological automatic response in the dog that he doesn't choose. So for example, if you give a dog meat, or you give a dog food, he'll start to salivate because he's going to start to eat. He'll start to make saliva in the mouth. So this is called the conditioned stimulus because we will condition the dog to respond to it. And this is called the unconditioned stimulus because it's sort of a natural automatic response. And the response, salivation, is the unconditioned response. So during conditioning, we present the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, which makes the dog salivate, and eventually directly the sound, just the conditioned stimulus starts to elicit the conditioned response, the salivation. That's after many presentations. The animal, the organism, will have associated these, and he will produce the conditioned response in response to the conditioned stimulus. How does this work in the real world? How is it relevant for medical psychology? Well, the placebo effect is one effect that works via classical conditioning. For example, a conditioned stimulus might be the shape of a pill. Because you've grown up in our society where you have some pills from the doctor like this that make you healthy, or for example, they suppress your pain. So maybe it's a painkiller that suppresses pain. So because over time you've taken pills of this shape and it caused the unconditioned response, response of pain relief, now all you need is the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, which is the shape of the pill, to cause the response, the pain relief, right? Originally, it was because of the medicine, like the chemical inside, right? That was the unconditioned stimulus, caused the response, which is pain relief. But now, because the shape of the pill, you've always seen it just like the bell, the shape of the pill is like the bell, you see the pill that's like the shape, and you feel pain. Your pain is reduced even though you don't take the chemical. It could just be sugar. That's called the placebo effect. One example of a placebo effect where you actually give a real drug to the person, the unconditioned stimulus, which is paired with the specific shape of the pill. And then after conditioning, if I give you a pill of this shape with nothing in it, then already you'll feel a type of similar physiological response as if I gave you the medicine, the chemical, the active drug. A different type of learning is instrumental conditioning. It's also known as operant conditioning. And in instrumental conditioning, behavior is learned as a result of a behavior. Or I should say a behavior is learned to result in a given consequence, right? So if the consequence is rewarding, they'll increase the behavior, and if the consequence is punishing, then or noxious, then the behavior will likely decrease. So for example, this is a famous situation where you have a box with a mouse, or a rat in this case, and in the box, when there's the light is on, the red left light is on, then he should push the lever. That's his behavior, his response, and then that will get him a food pellet. He'll get some food. And then he will learn the behavior, push the lever, when you have this conditioned stimulus of the light. And this, again, there's a real-world example that's relevant for medical psychology. If you have some phobia, for example, if you have a car accident in a tunnel, you might have learned that you should not go in tunnels because now you have associated going into a tunnel with pain, right? And you have learned that maybe pain can be avoided by not going into tunnels. So you'll be afraid of going into tunnels. So avoiding the tunnel is a kind of reward, no punishment by physical pain. But if you never go into the tunnel again, you can't relearn the normal situation, right? The tunnel should lead to no pain because usually you don't get an accident in a tunnel. So you can't, there's no extinction of the avoidance behavior. So your tunnel phobia remains. So one way we'll learn later in the class to therapy for phobias is to basically introduce, I guess not forcefully, but gradually introduce the normal pairing to a person who has a phobia to try to get them to learn over the undesired association, the undesirable conditioning that they've acquired from whatever traumatic experience they have. Okay, so that is all for today. Today we covered intelligence, different definitions of intelligence, theories, and the different type of tests. Remember that the WAIST test, the Wechsler intelligence test, is the sort of the most common main test, or the Raven matrices is for sort of culture-free tests. Testing fluid intelligence. And then we talked about intelligence and its consequences. So it predicts education, it predicts health, things like this. And then finally we talked about heritability of intelligence, how much genes contribute to intelligence based on the H2, the concordance prediction of how much the variance is predicted by variance in genetic similarity. Finally, I did a short bit about learning, which is how it's related to health. So we talked about classical conditioning and how that has caused probably you to have some type of placebo effect with the shape of pills, or pills in general. And then also we'll talk about instrumental conditioning. We talked about instrumental conditioning and how it can be used, how it causes sort of phobias in the first place, and how it can be used to unlearn or learn over extinction learning over the undesirable conditioning as a type of therapy for phobias. And we'll learn about that later, much later in this course.